Our story tonight begins on a hill brushed with moonlight, far from the noise of towns and clocks, where silence is stitched with the bleating of sheep and the rustle of tall grass. And she is Isoda, the shepherdess, who understands the language of the land, when the sky is a vast, inky canvas, sprinkled with countless diamonds. She finds comfort in the timeless rhythm of the seasons, the birth of lambs in spring, the lazy days of summer, the golden hues of autumn, and the hushed stillness of winter. The stars seem to shimmer in response to her stories, and the wind carries her words to the farthest corners of the land. Even the sheep appear mesmerized, their heads raised in silent wonder as they listen to the tale. And then, when the first rays of sunlight begin to touch the horizon, painting the sky with hues of rose and gold, her weaving comes to an end. The last thread hangs suspended in the air, shimmering like a captured star, and with a gentle sigh, she lets it drift away. The sheep stir, their bleating echoing the awakening of the day, and Isilda rises, stretching her arms toward the heavens. The sky quilt, woven with starlight and stories, watches over her as she begins her day. The wind whispers its approval, and the hills hold the echoes of her tales until the next night, when the sky falls silent and the stars come out to play. And the girl who speaks their language will be there to greet them with open arms and a heart full of wonder. It begins with a girl, a shepherd, and a sky stitched with dreams. This is a place of quiet magic, where the wind whispers stories and the hills hold memories close. Her loyal dog, Bram, curls up at her side, his warm body a comforting presence. Now she reaches into a bag and pulls out a small bundle of wool. It's a special shade of blue, the color of twilight and dreams. This is no ordinary wool. It's spun from starlight and whispered stories. Every thread shimmers with magic, and its soft texture feels like stardust on her fingertips. With gentle hands, she begins to weave, not on an actual loom, but in the very air around her. Her fingers move in graceful arcs, mimicking the patterns of the stars above. And as she weaves, she tells tales of bravery, of kindness, of love and loss, of hope that shines brighter than any star. Her voice is a soothing melody, weaving its way into the fabric of the night. The stories she tells are ancient, passed down from generations of wise shepherds who understood the language of the stars. There's the story of the ram who wandered beyond the hills and discovered new lands, the tale of the shepherdess and the nightingale whose song saved her village from a terrible fate, and the legend of the star weaver who mended the sky when it was torn by a terrible storm. Each story is a masterpiece, a luminous thread that adds another layer of meaning to the starry expanse above her. And now it's time for bed, so gather close, dear listener, for tonight we'll spend a little more time with Elswith and her friends. The sheep are nestled together in a tight ball, their soft bleating echoing in the night. Their woolly bodies are warm and fuzzy, just like a big, fluffy blanket. And high above them, the stars twinkle in the velvet darkness. Every single one of them has a name, a story, a song, and she knows them all by heart. Elswith gathers up her blanket, which is colored with the hues of twilight, and she settles down on the soft, dewy grass. As the night deepens, the sky becomes alive with wonder. Isilda woke before sunrise. Her sheep were already stirring, their bells like scattered notes across the hills. She stretched, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders, a souvenir from days spent weaving tales and tending skies. Sunlight slanted through her tent, painting stripes of gold on her wool and spindle. Her satchel of wool, and the braid of starlight, now a silent thrum against her fingers. Leaving the hilltop, she descended into the greening valley, her footsteps crunching on the dewy grass. Below her, the world was waking. Soon, the music grew louder, pulling her toward the source, a clearing bathed in sunlight where other shepherds and their flocks had made camp. She sat with the others, sharing stories and smiles. For a while, the hours drifted by, measured only by the children's spinning game and the drifting clouds overhead. But the sun climbed higher, and Isilda knew she couldn't stay. In the center, a group of children danced in a ring, their laughter echoing between the trees. As the day lengthened, the sky blazed with the colors of fading light. Overhead, the stars began their slow ascent, one by one, until the heavens were a canvas of deepening blue. With the coming dark, Isilda returned to her hilltop, her steps light, her heart full. Each bend in the river, each rustle in the leaves, each chirp of crickets was a note in the symphony of her world. Their song spoke of light and life, chasing away the remnants of the night. Gathering her wool and spindle, she settled down, ready to spin the day's events into a new tale. As the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the tent wall, she began her nightly ritual, naming the stars and weaving their light into her yarn. Each pull, each twist, was a stitch in the quilt of night, binding her to the ancient practice of storytelling. And as the hours passed, the stories flowed from her fingers, whispered on the wind, carried on the breath of the night. Isilda smiled, feeling the joy tug at her heartstrings. Birdsong swelled, leaves unfurled, and the river babbled secrets to the stones. Before long, the melody from the valley floor reached her, weaving itself into the fabric of the day. With a final glance at the sky, she joined the rising notes, her voice blending with the choir of awakening things. Glancing down at her wrist, she saw the braid of starlight holding fast. For a moment, she felt the echoes of hundreds of stories, each stitch thrumming with memory. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of wood smoke and distant singing. Isilda smiled visitors. It was always a surprise to hear music drift up the hill, a reminder that she wasn't the only weaver of tales. Though her flock was restless now, eager for pasture, she waited, enjoying the lingering peace of dawn. Isilda knelt and scratched behind his ears, marveling at his steadfast presence, another constant thread in her ever-shifting story. Beside the gushing water, she rested, sharing her bread and cheese with Bram, who laughed up the remnants with a grateful whine. As she ate, she saw the river for the first time as a ribbon unspooling across the land, a silver seam binding the hills to the waiting sea. When the first rays touched the tops of the hills, the music reached its fullest, carried on the wind like dandelion seeds. It was time for her to move, time for the story to shift with the sun. Tearing down her tent, she gathered her few possessions, each touched by the light. At the foot of the hill, her faithful dog, Bram, nudged her hand, tail thumping a welcome to the day. When the feast was done, Isilda continued her journey, following the river's course. As she stepped into the clearing, the music flowed around her, welcoming her to the shared tapestry of their lives. With a fond farewell, she set off again, retracing her steps toward the silent hills. She pitched her tent under the watchful eye of the rising moon. Close your eyes once more. Feel the hush settle around you like the hem of a warm cloak. Let the stars above you hang heavy, gentle like fruit on a silver tree, and drift now into the breath of the hills, into the voice of sleep. For our story continues. Chapter 26. Woven in starlight long ago, when the world was new, starlight dripped from the skies. It fell on mountains, valleys, even seas, and where it touched, it wove magic into the fabric of things. The starlight lingered longest on Shepherd's Hill, coloring the wool of the first sheep silver. Those sheep became ancestors to Isilda's flock, each strand of their wool holding a piece of starlight. It was why her grandmother had said, "Touch these sheep, and you will hold the stories of the universe in your palms." Chapter 27. Threads of reverie. When the frost came, Isilda wove, not cloth nor rug nor any housewifely thing, but a net of gossamer threads, as fine as cobwebs and as tough as spider silk. She strung it between the sheltering pines and decorated it with the brightest berries and seed heads. It shimmered in the sunlight and caught the moonlight, drawing wisps of cloud into its curves. Those clouds became dreams, tumbling and rolling, shifting and swirling in the patterns of slumber. Anyone who gazed upon the threads of reverie could not help but feel their eyelids growing heavy and their breaths slowing. Chapter 28. The Shepherdess watches. Not all who dwell among the hills are born of flesh and bone. The shepherdess watches from a craggy peak, older than rock and colder than the north wind. She has no face, only watchful eyes that gleam like ice. No voice, only a presence that chills the marrow. Yet Isilda felt her gaze sometimes heavy as frost, and knew to spin a double thread that day, braided with courage and calm. When the shepherdess watches, you must spin with care. Chapter 29. A world undone. In a forgotten corner of the larder, Isilda found a chest bound with leather straps. It was filled with objects that sang with ancient power, each one tied to a story of earth and sky. There was a chipped clay pot that held moonbeams, a necklace of feathers that whispered secrets on the wind, and a cracked mirror that reflected dreams. But the most captivating was a simple spindle whorl, carved with swirling patterns. As Isilda spun, the whorl thrummed with energy, and she felt the world unraveling and rewinding, galaxies collapsing and expanding, stars fading and igniting. Time itself seemed to hinge on the turn of her spindle. Chapter 30. Recollections. One evening, as Isilda sat by her fire, a gust of wind snatched up a dry leaf from the hearth and carried it out her open door. She stepped out to retrieve it, and as she brushed its brittle surface, memories swirled within her like smoke. She saw fields of barley swaying in the breeze, heard the echo of children's laughter, smelled the sweet temps of summer rain, and she knew the leaf had been more than just a leaf. It had been a thread, a connection to moments past. Two people loved, two stories that shaped her, and though the leaf was gone, the memories remained woven into the fabric of her being. Chapter 31. A cradle of stars. Not all cradles hold babes. Under the watchful eye of the constellation Dipper, Isilda had fashioned a cradle of stars. She named them Lullaby. Lullaby, they sang, as the Big Dipper dipped toward the western hills. Their song, a gentle rocking, a timeless lullaby. She hummed it to herself, feeling the rhythm of the universe in her bones, the pulse of creation echoing within her own heart. And as she swayed, cradled by the melody, she knew that the stars themselves were singing her to sleep. Are you awake or asleep? Or are you both? Perhaps the line blurs between waking and sleeping when surrounded by stories and starlight. Maybe that's why they're whispered, those tales, so that they catch the wind and wrap around you as you drift off. They're threads of memory, love, and magic meant to stitch together the daydreams of the living and the bedtime tales of the almost forgotten. The shepherdess watches still, but perhaps she's watching you, too. Watching you remember, watching you dream, watching you carry stories in your heart and share them with the world. For that is the greatest magic of all, isn't it? The ability to hold a story and let it live inside you, shaping you, guiding you, reminding you that even in the darkest nights, the faintest glimmer of hope can shine through. And in the quietest moments, if you listen very closely, you might just hear the stars whispering their tales on the wind. Isilda, shepherdess of the sky quilt, dreamer of lost stars and finder of echoes. She watches all night. This is the final episode of our limited series. As you know, this project is entirely fan-funded and has been for the past 2 years. We make no money from this. This is purely for fun, and because we love to share these silly little stories with you all. Not stirred, just stood still, as though listening. Isilda approached. In his eyes, she saw something deep, old, not quite sheep, not quite animal. She reached out, resting her fingers on the brass bell around his neck. It chimed once. Isilda dreamed of them once. Long-necked, pale-fleeced creatures that wandered through sky and thought. They made no sound. There was one night once every 7 years when the stars faded. Not all, but many. Shepherds knew to mark it. It was called a forgetting night. Isilda walked to the ridge where she could see all the valley. As always, please take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time, sleep well. The stars were brilliant, each one humming, but one, just above the tree line, flickered with a soft, pulsing rhythm. She'd never named it before. She placed her spindle on the ground and raised her voice softly. For you who watches the shepherd sleep, for you who close the night gently, I name you Rest Stitch, for you bind the end to the beginning. The star glowed, the wind ceased, and the earth held its breath. You are wrapped in this, too, not by fabric, but by breath, by names, by stars. Let yourself drift now, for Isolde sleeps, and so may you, safely, softly. Isolde prepared for it, laying out threads tied with names, waited to be remembered, waited for breath, waited for you. She walked the perimeter of the pasture, murmuring stories aloud, one by one. Bram followed. The sheep stood still, and when the stars dimmed, they did not vanish. They waited. Roots will remember, she whispered, and next spring the moss will bloom brighter. So she stood, arms open, and whispered, I see you. I name you. I know your warmth. I carry your light. And slowly, one by one, they returned. Their hooves touched nothing, but wherever they walked, silence deepened, and dreams became clearer. She called them the flock of echoes. That autumn morning, as leaves fell like thoughts returning home, Isolde dug a shallow groove by the old oak. Inside, she placed 3 threads. One red, for love unspoken. One white, for memories of laughter. One blue, for sleep never found. Then she covered it gently. The ground, she believed, had its own dreams, and they needed tucking in. That morning, she found 5 footprints in the dew. Too large for her sheep, too deep for wind. She did not follow them. Each bell a name. With that said, let's begin. And the shepherdess, always watching, a life a night spent watching, a whisper given shape, only bowed. Then she spun a length of black wool, thin as shadow, for the ones who walk where memory meets sky, she said. She left the thread hanging from a hawthorn branch. The sound was rich, not metallic, but round, like an echo in a deep cavern, or the last note of a lullaby remembered from childhood. Isolde whispered, You've heard them too, haven't you? The bell chimed again. Then silence. The wool grew damp, but she spun anyway, and in that silence, she imagined a flock in the stars. Each star a woolly soul, each twist a quiet reply. The damp wool glistened faintly. She called this thread. If you'd like to help us keep making content like this, please do consider supporting us through our link in the description box. Just a steady mist, silver as breath, soft as spun silk. A prayer for herself, for the stars, for the ones listening now. It was real. She stood before it, vast, unfathomable. Tonight, she lit it again. Isolde sat by moonlight, the spindle in her hand, worn smooth by years of dreaming. A patchwork of stars, fog, wind, laughter, hooves, names, sorrows, and songs. The wool caught, stuttered, and turned in jerks. She frowned softly. In the flickering light, the shadow of the spindle seemed longer. The fire was warm. The sheep were still. Each patch was a moment, and in the center, stitched in thread to find 4 eyes, her name. And yours. He had not bleeded. It rained that night. Not hard, not cruel. In her dreams, Isolde saw it. The sky quilt. Not just imagined, not just metaphor. She reached out to touch the fabric, and it pulsed, warm. It was the last night before snow. The air crisp, the wool thick, the sky sharp with light. There are sheep, it is said, that walk only in memory. You are part of this, it seemed to say. Not all quilts are above. Some lie beneath the earth. Every breath, every gaze, every silence, it is all sewn here. She awoke with the taste of starlight on her tongue, and a single glowing thread curled in her palm. Isolde did not speak. She simply nodded and let the spindle spin. Isolde turned her face up to it, letting the drops fall over her cheeks like the brushing of grandmother's hands. She held out her spindle. It's how the sky weeps its stories into us, she murmured. Each droplet, a forgotten thought. It was used, she said. Only 4 stories of healing. For those who needed peace they couldn't name. For sorrows that had forgotten their shape. She tied one such thread to a branch near her sleeping place. Chapter 26. The Spindle's Shadow. But tonight, it spun oddly. Her grandmother once kept a small lantern filled, not with oil, but with beeswax and wild thyme. Bees know where dreams are sweet, she'd say, striking flint to the wick. Isilda had carried that lantern since the elder passed. The scent of thyme and honey drifted over the flock. One by one, the sheep grew still. Even Bram, usually alert to any fox's stir, laid his head down on his paws with a long, relaxed sigh. She held the lantern high, letting its glow cast strange shadows against the tall grass. Then she whispered to no one in particular, to the hive and the stars, to the pollen of memory, to the honeycomb of dreams. And the wind, soft as a sigh, carried her words to the sky. Even Bram lay quiet, but the thread, she looked closer, almost like it spun something beyond the wool, as if each turn twisted air. Memory, silence itself. She leaned in, and in that silence, a voice, low and slow, seemed to breathe through the hills. Spin gently, child. The threads you twist tonight are, not just for warmth, but for remembering. Chapter 27. The Lantern of Bees. Chapter 28. The Bellwether Song. The bellwether of her flock, a strong, steady ram with a single curled horn, stood apart tonight. Chapter 29. Threads from Rain. Chapter 30. The Quilt Unfolds. Chapter 31. The Flock of Echoes. Chapter 32. The Night the Sky Forgot. Chapter 33. The Quilt Beneath. Chapter 34. Final Star of the Season. Thank you for watching this final chapter of Isilda's story. Tonight's story is extra special because it's part of an exciting collaboration with a good friend. We both love fairy tales and folklore, especially those mysterious ones where magic hides in everyday things. That's why we teamed up to bring you a magical journey with the first 8 chapters of a captivating story about a girl who wove starlight into tapestries. Can you believe it? Starlight. Isn't that enchanting? It's not just a story, though. It's a chance to explore themes that resonate with us. Both the power of storytelling. The story dives into these themes with a depth that will touch your heart. The girl who woke starlight. The stars are waiting. The wind has slowed to listen, and the quilt of night has been drawn up to your chin. You are safe now, held by hush and breath and lullaby. And our story drifts onward. Chapter 35. The first thread. Isilda once asked her grandmother, who wove the very first thread of the sky. Her grandmother had smiled, stirring the kettle. They say it was the wind, she answered. The breath of the world, spun by the fingers of night. Isilda liked that story. She imagined the wind forming fingers at dusk, twisting the air into thread, humming as it worked. Tonight, the wind returned. Not cold, just present. Like a visitor arriving late but with kind eyes. Isilda lifted her spindle to it and whispered, "Will you weave with me?" She held it still, and the breeze curled gently around the wool, guiding its twist. Together, they spun silence and the sky blinked softly in approval. Chapter 36. The Old Shepherd at Twilight. As the sheep grazed low and the fire yawned into orange, a figure emerged from behind the hill, bent, wrapped in thick wool, eyes like twilight themselves. He carried no lantern, only a staff and a satchel that whispered as he walked. Isilda nodded. "Evening, Elda." The old shepherd lowered himself beside her with the ease of someone who has always known hills. He said nothing for a while, just looked up. Then, in a voice like stone, warmed by sun, he murmured, still weaving. Isilda smiled. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a piece of thread. It shimmered black and gold like night and sun twined together. He laid it in her palm. "That's the last dream I caught before forgetting my name." She nodded and tied it gently to her spindle. Chapter 37. The quiet star. Iselda watched the sky like a librarian watches stories. And one night she noticed something. A star that never moved, never blinked, never grew bright or dim. Just there. Soft. Constant. Still. She named it the quiet star and decided it was the one that listened. It didn't shine for beauty or guide sailors or carry tales of gods or beasts. It simply witnessed. That night, she didn't speak at all. She spun no wool, sang no tale. She just lay back on the grass and stared, and the quiet star stared back. And that, she believed, was enough. Chapter 38. Sheep clouds on certain mornings. The mist that rose from the lowlands took shapes. Once Isilda saw a ram drift through it, its horns spiraling like coiled braids. Another time, a lamb with wings. The sheep noticed, too. They stood still when the mist came. Silent. Respectful. She called them sheeplouts. The ones who returned only for a moment, to walk among their descendants and whisper wisdom through. She began tying duet grasses into loops and hanging them beside her threads. Tiny prayers, she said, for those just passing through. Chapter 39. The long nap. There came a day of stillness, so complete it felt like the world itself had closed its eyes. Even the bees hovered slower. The wind rested in the hollows, and the sheep lay down before dusk. Isilda called it the long nap. She didn't resist it. She wrapped herself in a wool cloak, laid her head beside Bram, and let sleep come before the stars did. She dreamed not of stars, but of looms. Looms the size of mountains, woven not with thread, but with silence. And the weavers, sleep itself, they spun her into a dream, and the dream spun into her. When she woke, her fingers were closed around a loop of silver thread. She didn't remember making it, but she tied it to the edge of the sky quilt. Chapter 40. The words between threads. Some threads held stories, others held silence, but a few held something rarer. Unspoken wishes. Isilda called them the between threads. They weren't dyed, weren't scented, just soft and nearly invisible. Spun on nights when words wouldn't come, when hearts were full, but lips stayed quiet. She spun one now. No song, no story, just breath, twist, breath, twist. Then she whispered into it, for what I do not know how to ask, for what aches, gently, without name. She tucked it beside a thread of moonmill and let it rest. Chapter 41. Bram Starrett was nearing the turning of the year. Bram older now, slower, rested more. He no longer chased shadows or circled the flock like a restless moon. He sat beside Isilda, head against her knee, his eyes fixed on a single point in the sky. She followed his gaze. A faint twinkle. Easy to miss. Is that yours? She asked. He wagged his tail once, so she spun him a thread. Warm brown. Touched with white, she tied it into a loop, placed it around his neck like a medal, and said, "There, Bram's star. Always above, always beside." He licked her hand once, then fell asleep with a deep sigh. Chapter 42. The fireflies of frost. As frost crept into the valley, little lights began to flicker among the trees. Not stars, not lamps. Fireflies of frost. They glowed, pale blue, drifting slowly, leaving tiny trails like forgotten threads unraveling. Isilda followed them one night to a hidden dell where snow never stayed. There, she found tiny pods cracked open like seed husks, glowing faintly. She touched one. It was warm. Inside, coiled tighter than wool, was a thread of light. She brought it back and spun it into the softest skein she'd ever known. "For winter's warmth," she whispered. And the hush between flakes, she tied it to the edge of the quilt. Chapter 43. Naming the listener one evening, Isilda turned to the stars and said, "I think someone listens." She wasn't speaking to Bram, or the sheep, or even the sky. She was speaking to you, somewhere, somewhen. The one listening in the quiet, the one following her breath, the one tracing her words like footsteps on snow. So she spun a thread just for you, soft, dream-colored, dyed in dusk and silence. She wove it into the quilt's heart and whispered, "For the one who listens, the quiet companion. May this thread keep you warm." And with that, the stars shimmered gently, and the story turned another page. Breathe deep now. You are not just hearing the tale. You are in it. Woven, held. And as you drift deeper, know this. The sky remembers you. Thank you for joining us on this enchanting journey. And if you're as captivated by the story as we are, don't forget to show your support. Your encouragement means the world to us. Until next time, may the magic of stories always keep you company. And may you find comfort in the whispers of the night. Welcome back to the series, where every story is a thread in the tapestry. Welcome back to the series, where every story is a thread in the tapestry. Spring had come to the hills, but Isilda was inside, mending nets and darning socks. Night after night, the same star burned brightly over the alder grove Isilda used to trace its path as she spun. One night, looking up, Isilda saw the moon hanging high and clear, looking thin, pale, tired. Every spinner has one, a thread that snarls, tightens, and resists. With Isilda, it was a knot hidden deep in her satchel. She tried once to untie it. The fibers whispered things, not in words, but in emotions. Looking up one evening, Isilda traced a new shape among the stars, a shepherd's crook, white as cloud milk, with ears so soft they folded like paper. Isilda wrapped it in her cloak and named it Whisper. It followed her, not with noise, but with gaze. Every step she took, it mirrored, silent, certain. That night she spun a thread from its wool, so fine it shimmered like breath on glass. "Some things," she said, "don't need to be heard to be true." She tied it near the star of Whisper. Not perfect, but close enough. She named it the Keeper's Hook. Isilda lay back, eyes open, wrapped her quilt around her shoulders. The stars seemed to close, too bright. Memories tugged at her heart, threads pulled tight. "May your knots hold mysteries, and may your loom dream often," she whispered. "Have I woven too much?" The sheep didn't stir. The breeze didn't answer. Only the grass replied, curling under her, holding her gently. That's when she understood the quilt wasn't just hers. It was the earth's, the sky's, the silences. She was only its steward. She closed her eyes and let the heaviness drift into dreams. "Guides the wanderers and watches the lost," she whispered. "Died in stories, woven across centuries." The loom whispered, "You spin us, but we spin you too." She woke with a start. In her lap was a new spool. She hadn't spun it, but it matched her dream. Silver and dusk brown, soft as breath, wound tight with care. She placed it on a shelf, labeled it "Gift from the Dreaming Loom." She spun a thread of strong fiber, undyed, clean, and firm, a border thread, a thread for strength and return, a thread for guardianship. That night, she wove it into the edge of her quilt, the one that holds the rest. She heard longing, heard also a silence too loud to hold, the ache of goodbye. So she stopped tugging. Instead, she wrapped the knot in a velvet scrap, tied it gently with sage string, and nestled it in the underside of her quilt. "Not every thread needs to be straight," she said. "Some are meant to hold mysteries." Maybe the moon needed a rest, she thought, making a blanket for the moon. She chose the softest fleece from her flock, scented with thyme, then dyed it in milk and pearl dust. That night she folded it thrice and placed it atop the highest hill. "Sleep well tonight," she told the moon. And as the clouds drifted by, she could have sworn the stars pulsed slower, as if breathing, and the moon looked full again. One day she looked up and gasped. The star was gone. One morning, Isilda's hound, Bram, was slower than usual, his muzzle whiter, ears lower. But when she heard him bark once, lightly, then twice, she followed. He stood at the top of a hill, looking east. She knew then that he wanted her to come with him. They walked through thistles, past too heavy into a clearing she had never seen before. Wild. Time grew there in spirals. He walked in circles, walked once around her, then laid down. He looked up at her once more, then slept. The wind kissed his fur, and the clearing shimmered. Isilda stayed with him for a long time, not crying, just remembering. Later, she spun a single dark brown thread, silent, steady, and strong. She named it Faithful Shadow and placed it beside Bram's star. She waited for it to reappear, but it didn't. Days turned to weeks, yet it never returned. One evening, she brought out her bundle of wool, a bit of honeycomb and a drop of dew, and buried them beneath the tree where she last saw the star. For what's vanished, she said. Then she spun a thread, gray-blue, soft and unsure, the color of smoke on snow. She didn't tie it to the quilt, she just let it lie. Another story without an ending. Sometimes, absence is a stitch too. Her fingers itched for something older, stronger, softer. So she went to the hawthorn tree and the old loom half buried beneath its roots. Now covered in green, its frame was still carved with spiral patterns, snails, or slow dances. But there was no sign of the grasses or petals she had threaded last fall. Brushing moss away, she found something new, a bit of wool, soft and white as cloud. She threaded the loom with it, and whatever magic slept in the wood and the wool, it woke. The loom sang not with music or words, but with presence. When she pulled the first finished length of cloth, it shimmered and faded, showing only a whisper of the colors she had threaded, colors she knew only from dreams. Folding that dream into the quilt, she added the threads and the piece whole. Before we begin tonight's episode, I have a question for you. What do you think Isilda will name her next thread? How will it fit into the quilt? What story do you think it will hold? Pause the video here if you want to make a guess. Now then, without further ado, let us spin our tailies together. Chapter 44. The Loom Beneath the Tree. Chapter 45. Stars That Never Returned. Chapter 46. The Blanket for the Moon. Winter settled on the land. Bare branches clawed at the pale sky. Chapter 47. The Knot That Could Not Be Untied. Chapter 48. Bram's Last Walk. Chapter 49. Constellation of the Crook. Chapter 50. The Lamb Born in Silence. One morning, a lamb was born in total silence. No bleeding, no struggle, just arrival. Chapter 51. The sky feels heavy tonight. Some nights the sky feels heavy, even its beauty weighs. Chapter 52. The loom dreams back. That night Isilda dreamt. She was thread, spun by invisible fingers. So ends tonight's episode. May your own threads be ever strong and true. Chapter 61. Where stories began before there were stars or songs or sleepy sheep to count, there was only stillness. And within that vast quiet, a seed was sown, not by hands or feet or any craft of earth, but by the tiniest twitch of a heart. Settle back. Not just a collection of stitched stars and symbols, but something more. A living memory. Isilda called it the quilt of listening, because it held not only what she saw, but what she heard. A child's laugh from a spring meadow. Its wool was pure and pale, and on its back was a perfect birthmark shaped like a six-pointed star. Isilda wept when she saw it, not from sadness, and Ellen found herself gathering not just wool and thread, but little things that seemed to whisper. A crow's feather tucked behind her ear, a pinnacone that smelled of distant rain. Soft, gentle, patient. A man stood there, robed in forest green, eyes rimmed with frost. Some of the earliest squares in the quilt had shifted. 3 moons, visible at once. One full and golden, one blue and pale. Near the horizon, it was pale, almost colorless, threaded in whites and grays, like clouds before rain. No symbol, no image, just stillness. And when she laid her hand upon it, she slept more deeply than ever before. No dreams, just rest, true rest, and one red and ghostly, a reflection caught in mist. Isilda and Ellen carried the quilt outside that night, laid it on the grass, and sat upon it. Stars above, stars below. The moons cast 3 shadows from each of them, and in that moment, Ellen whispered, "What are we becoming?" And Isilda answered, not with words, but with a square she had stitched that afternoon. A figure, walking a path made of stars, and a second figure walking just behind her, until they became the same. Colors brightened, edges soft, threads moved subtly, as though breathing. At first, she thought it was just a light, but Isilda only smiled. "It's waking," she said. "For what?" "For you, I was told," he said. "There is a woman here who stitches the sky." Isilda nodded, ushered him in, gave him tea, warmed with lavender. He did not speak much, but his eyes never left the quilt. After an hour, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a scrap of cloth, tattered, ancient, marked with a faded constellation. "I found this," he whispered, "in a cave above the fjords. It hums in my hands." Isilda touched it, then handed it to Ellen. "Your turn," she said softly. And Ellen, with trembling fingers, stitched the scrap into the quilt's edge. That square is known as the Forgotten Star Map. Even now, no one knows where it leads. But if you sleep beside it, your dreams may try to follow. A bit of melted beeswax from the last of the honey candles. Isilda smiled gently. "You're stitching with more than hands now." And so Ellen added a square of her own. Her very first. It showed a black feather resting on a flickering flame. It was simple, but when you touched it, the air felt warm, and some said you could hear wings. But because she had once dreamed of such a creature, Ellen loved to lie awake and listen. The fire cracking, the sheep shifting in their sleep. But most of all, the snow. Snow, when it falls just right, has a sound. A hush that isn't silence. A rhythm without beats. A quiet song only the resting can hear. She stitched that into the quilt too, though it had no picture. Just thread so faint it could barely be seen, shimmering under firelight. They called it the listening thread, and some believed it could only be seen by those close to dreaming. She named it so. Ellen stitched its likeness into the quilt. A soft star nestled among gentle wool, eyes closed in eternal calm. Travelers would one day touch that square and ask, was it real? And the shepherdess would only smile and say, do you feel it in your chest? If they said yes, then it was. The soft clink of the shepherdess's cup in the early morning chill, the way a ewe's hooves tapped lightly over stone, searching for its lamb. Eleanor, small hands steady, began to understand what was being sown. Not a picture, not a pattern, but a feeling, a place the soul could rest in. A quiet that remembered you. Let the hush of this next chapter draw you deeper into rest. And Ellen, curled near the hearth, would wake to see her murmuring softly, eyes half closed, her needle still dancing. What are you sewing? Ellen once asked, voice barely a breath. And Isilda, her voice even softer, replied, tonight, I'm sewing the sigh the stars made when the earth was born. The quilt accepted it. The next morning, that square shimmered faintly, like light caught in a teardrop. Ellen called it the first exhale. And no matter how long you stared at it, you couldn't remember the shape, only how it made you feel. Chapter 62. The threads of memory, one square at a time. The quilt began to take on a shape of its own. Chapter 63. When dreams spilled over sometime. When Isilda stitched late into the night, she would drift into dreams. Chapter 64. A sheep with a star on its back. One late summer morning, a lamb was born beneath a silver dawn. Chapter 65. The feather and the flame. Autumn arrived like a hush over the hills. The fire burned a little longer each night. Chapter 66. The sound of snow. That winter was slow and soft, like wool falling from the sky. Chapter 67. The visitor from the north. One night, long after the last leaves had fallen, a knock came to the door. Chapter 68. Chapter 69. The night of the 3 moons. It was rare, so rare that villagers climbed the hill just to glimpse it. Chapter 70. The square with no name. Late one night, Ellen found a new square in the quilt. She had not sewn it, nor had he. You are here. You are safe. Let the sky quilt unfold once more. Chapter 61. The knot of forgetting while stitching a new border. Isildur's needle snagged. A knot in the thread. Tight. Refusing to budge. She pulled gently, but it only tangled worse. Frustrated, she nearly cut it away. But then, she paused. Held it up to the light. It was beautiful, tiny and round. It wasn't random. It formed a pattern. She traced it with her finger. It was a map. To what? She didn't know. A shepherd's path. A lost star. A story no one had told yet. The stars above were hidden. The sheep silent. She held her crook tight, heart pounding. Then, from the mist, a faint glow golden and warm lit the path. A tug. Not a hand. The quilt. It folded gently, wrapping her shoulders. No wind. No movement. Just will. It hummed a note so low, it echoed in her chest. Villagers called it the memory moon. Isildur sat beneath it, stitching a soft border around the quilt's edge. A sleepy dog. A gentle breeze. But she knew the quilt was done. One final seam remained binding the first star to the last. She chose a single, plain thread. The color of breath. She stitched it slowly. With every pass, she whispered something she'd learned. Kindness lasts. Dreams. Ripple. Silence. Listens. And when the last stitch was tied, the quilt exhaled. So did she. As she worked, memories filled her. Her mother's lullaby. The first lamb she named. The storm that broke her loom. The way her father laughed with his eyes. She didn't cry. She just stitched. And named the border Memory's Thread. Because some memories don't fade, they glow. Then she heard words not from outside, but inside. We remember. She pressed her hand to the center and replied, so do I. From then on, the quilt stitched faster, as if guiding her hands, as if it knew what came next. Not fire, not moon, something else. It floated just ahead of her steps. Pausing whenever she paused, she laid the quilt on the grass and waited. The stars seemed to shift, align. Patterns she hadn't noticed emerged. A shepherd's crook, a spindle, a sleeping lamb. She saw constellations she hadn't stitched but had dreamed. One star blinked, then another, until the sky mirrored her quilt exactly. The stars had followed her. She closed her eyes, let a tear fall on the fabric, and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." She followed it home. In the morning, it was gone. But a warm glowing stone sat where her boots had been. She stitched its shape into the quilt's heart, naming it the shepherd's lantern. She plucked a single tuft and pressed it into the quilt's border, using clear thread. Moss, after all, remembers water. Isildur sat still, hand resting on the quilt. Even her breath felt quiet. She listened, not for sounds, but for what lived beneath them. And she felt it deep hums within wool, in her bones, in the earth. Some silences speak. She wove no pattern that day, just one long line of uninterrupted thread. She named it Stillness, and it held more sound than any song. It would help the quilt remember where it had been. Like a memory trying to stay hidden, she left the knot as it was stitched around it, named it the knot of forgetting. Because even the moments we forget shape the fabric of who we are. Chapter 62. The wool that dreamed one afternoon. She found a bit of wool caught in a thistle. It shimmered faintly, finer than spider thread. When she held it, she felt awed. Images bloomed behind her eyes. A lamb in a field of purple clover. A moonlit stream. A lullaby no one had sung yet. The wool, it seemed, held dreams. She spun it carefully, wove it into a crescent at the quilt's edge. It pulsed gently like something asleep. Listening, she whispered, "Rest well," and tucked it in. Chapter 63. The map in the moss. Isildur often napped beside the sheep. One afternoon, She woke to find moss curling across a nearby rock. Chapter 64. The fleece of the wind-touched lamb. There was one lamb, pale as smoke, that no one could catch. It appeared on the windiest days, danced between gusts, then vanished. The villagers called it whim. One day, let Isilda near, she whispered. Nothing. Moved gently. It pressed its side against her hand. When it turned to go, a tuft of its fleece floated free caught in the breeze. She caught it mid-air. When spun, it became a silken thread that whistled as she worked. Soft, musical. She wove it into a spiral, calling it the wind's footprint. Chapter 65. The shepherd's lantern one foggy night. She nearly lost her way. Chapter 66. The silence of wool. There came a day when no sheep bleated, no bird called, no breeze whispered. Silence hung, soft and heavy. Chapter 67. The quilt speaks one evening. As she stitched a final corner, she felt. Chapter 68. The stars answer on the longest night of the year. Isilda climbed the tallest hill. Chapter 69. The memory moon. A rare moon rose that summer round. Chapter 70. The last seaman came one evening like any other, a quiet field. The end is always the beginning of something else, isn't it? The ending of a life, the beginning of remembering. When we talked about the last episode, many of you commented that you thought we might be nearing the end. This is our final chapter of Isilda's story. And yes, it feels like an ending. But endings, as they tend to do, have their own beginnings sewn up in their threads. And today, we bring you the first part of Chapter 7. Let your breath become slow, like fog drifting across the hills. Let your limbs grow heavy, like mossless stones under starlight. You are warm. You are safe. Because even those we haven't met hold places in our stories. She had tried again and again, until she stopped trying. And one afternoon, while watching a lamb sleep beneath an ash tree, she understood. It wasn't her stitch. It was for something yet to come. She named it the stitch that waited. Because even unfinished stories deserve to belong. So she left it empty. A space to hold the unknown. And the sky quilt continues to unfold. Not mist. A cloud resting along the grass. It shimmered when she touched it. Cool, but not wet. But he walked as if the land itself had taught him to. Not fog. She blinked back and knew the quilt was awake. Not just alive, but aware. Even the pieces of us that lag behind deserve to be stitched into the story. It had become more than warmth, more than a story. It lingered behind, paused when she didn't, turned when she faced forward. She stood still and whispered, "Are you lost?" The shadow nodded. Gently, she traced it onto parchment and embroidered the outline into the quilt's back, where no one would see it but her. She brushed her fingers over the quilt's edge one night. She felt it, not in air, but memory. They listened. The stars seemed to draw closer. She did nothing. The wind leaned in. She sewed a single blank square into the quilt, white, pure, She had always filled time with making, naming, weaving. It is strength that whispers, "I am still enough." But this pause. If you enjoyed this story, please leave us a like. And if you have a moment before you go, we invite you to write a brief note of thanks or a memory you'd like to share. Our favorites will be read aloud on a future episode. Please visit our website to add your voice. And forget to subscribe to our podcast feed, so you won't miss the final 10 episodes of the world. Available only there. See you soon. Only trust. Thunder bellowed. The flame hissed and curled like a ribbon of memory. But within the folds of that quilt, there was quiet stillness. Warm to the touch. Alive with soft energy. A hush that no wind could stir. Breathe. And in the center of the quilt, the stitched stars shimmered once, then blinked. Just once. It had become a being made of time and tenderness, and it would remember, even long after she had fallen asleep beneath it. She named it the wool gatherer's shadow. When she laughed, it echoed gently, a sound like harp strings. She plucked a strand from its center barely visible and spun it beside her loom. Not loud, not metallic hopes. When the storm passed, the stars returned. One by one, some wove with moonlight, others sang two flax, until it's soft, soft, wooden like wind and hollow oak. She turned. Nothing, but her hands felt warmer, her thoughts clearer. Around her, the mountains echoed with the song of returning birds, a celebration of light. When woven, it felt like breath and hush combined. She made a circle with it, low and light, naming it the cloud beneath, a place for dreams to land. Isilda found him sitting beside her sheep, humming to them. He never asked for food or fire, only thread. Her hands ached, her heart, too. The sheep wandered. The wind passed, and it felt like defiance. She sat, watched, breathed, was its own thread. She named it the quiet rebellion, because rest is not laziness. She gave him a spool of her softest wool. He nodded, touched her hand once, and walked toward the hills. He never returned, but days later, she found that same spool empty, tucked beneath a stone with a perfect knot in the center. She wove it into the quilt, named it the thread that traveled. This last segment will be available only on our podcast feed. She hurried her flock beneath a rocky overhang and held the quilt tight around her shoulders. A bell. She walked to a loom and began a new line of embroidery without thinking. A bell-shaped curl. 3 ring. The sound stayed in her mind long after it had stopped. She named it the gentle bell, because some callings don't need volume. Lightning struck close, familiar. She watched a coal split end inside. A glowing thread of red gold light pulsed like a heartbeat. She fetched her needle, dipped it into the flame's edge, and when she pulled it out, the thread was real. She wove it quickly, before it cooled, into the lower hem of the quilt. It shimmered faintly, even by day. She named it the ember thread, a reminder that warmth outlives the fire. She closed her eyes and whispered stories into the wool, old Taili's names, and she stitched a zigzag of silver thread near the border, calling it the sky that fell and rose again. Their eyes kind. She saw one holding a newborn and whispering a story into a skein of yarn. They looked at her, not surprised. One reached out, smiled, and placed a golden spindle in her palm. "You were always meant to remember," she said. Isilda woke with tears drying on her cheeks, and a warmth in her chest that felt like 1,000 lullabies. So if you want to hear these final chapters, please download the app. If you've not done so already, her hands flew, guided by something deeper than muscle memory. By midday, she had finished the border of the quilt, each star linked to its fellows with silver thread. She stepped back, letting out her breath, and in the center of the quilt, where night met night, a single dark square waited. It was the shape of her dream, the size of a hand, and it pulled her in with a silent question. We'll link it in the show notes, and we hope you'll join us there for the final 10 episodes of the Walga. But for those of you who prefer to keep listening here, we'll still release the first part of each episode on our free podcast feed. Chapter 71. The Dreamers Who Came Before That Night. Isilda dreamt not of sheep or stars, but of women quiet and gentle spinning wool and firelight. Their hands were wise. In the quiet of the next morning, she went to her loom and began to weave. She named it The Dreamers Who Came Before. Chapter 72. The Stitch That Waited. There was one small square just left of the center that had remained empty. No thread would hold. No pattern felt right. Chapter 73. The day the sky fell, a storm rolled in, unlike any she'd seen. The sky cracked open. Clouds churned like sea waves. Chapter 74. The gentle bell one dawn, while tending a limping away she heard. Chapter 75. The ember thread one night. The hearth crackled in a way that felt. Chapter 76. The shepherd without a name. One evening, an old man came to the village. He carried no bag, no staff, no name. Chapter 77. The cloud beneath while napping in the field. She woke to find a cloud below her. Chapter 78. The wool-gatherer's shadow. She had always been followed by her own shadow. But one sunset, it didn't match her steps. Chapter 79. The quiet rebellion one morning. She didn't stitch. Chapter 80. The quilt opens its eyes. It happened without warning. Thank you for gathering with us today. Welcome back to the Starlight Quilt series. If this is your first time joining us here, welcome. We gather each week to stitch and share and rest in the quiet moments together. Today we begin a new section of the quilt. The final act, our focus, our center, the still point in the midst of it all. Not since childhood, not since her mother's voice last echoed in the valley. The ground shimmered every blade of grass, every stone mirrored the sky above. It was as if she walked on stars. One afternoon, a sheep sneezed itself backward into a bush, and Isilda laughed so hard she cried. She ran to the loom, giggling still, and began stitching a bright curl of yellow and pink threads. Loose in the morning, a single new stitch had appeared. It was clumsy, but earnest, a little red heart, and beneath it, a small stone had been placed on the floor, painted with tiny sheep. No one ever confessed, but she never removed it. She named the addition, the stitch in someone else's hand, because what we love, others will carry, even after us. Playful, it curled in from the outermost point wide at first, then tighter, smaller until it met the middle star where she'd first begun. She hadn't touched it in years, and one morning, without ceremony or fanfare, she sat by the fire and threaded her needle. She didn't plan, didn't map. She simply stitched a small, glowing moon beside the stitch that waited. No name this time, just presence. The quilt sighed when it was done, and she, at last, felt still. The spiral held every color she had ever used. It passed through sky blue, storm gray, moss green, and ember red. A journey inward, and a return. She named it the spiral of return, because all paths circle back to home, to self, to rest. Spiraled. The loops look like joy for ourselves, for our quilts, and for the stories that weave us home. She added tiny star-shaped bells to the corners when the quilt moved. It chuckled softly. She named this corner the loops that laughed, a reminder that joy, too, must be woven in. She didn't move at first, afraid it might vanish, but when she finally stepped forward, the stars followed. She walked the entire pasture with galaxies beneath her toes. Later, she wove silver thread into the bottom hem of the quilt each step a stitch. She named it the sky beneath, because sometimes wonder isn't above us, it's all around. But one morning, while sorting her skeins, the name returned. Unbeaten, she whispered it, Myra. And the wind paused. The sheep turned their heads. It never bleated, never strayed. It followed her from dawn to dusk, watching her every move with gentle understanding. Their flickers danced in long, lazy arcs above her flock. She sat watching them in silence, her hands still, her heart full. Then one landed on her palm. It blinked 3 times and flew off. And in that moment, she knew exactly what to stitch. She dyed a thread with crushed dandelion and lichen soft yellow with green hints, and stitched a trail of lights, winding across the middle of the quilt. She named it the firefly line, because wonder moves and memory glows, even when brief. She named it Juniper, and Juniper, it seemed, named her back. She draped the quilt over a simple wooden bench. People came, children touched the stars. Elders wept quietly beside the stitch that waited. She said nothing, just watched as each person found a square that belonged to them. One young boy whispered, "This one is mine," while touching the gentle bell. She nodded. The quilt did not just hold stories, it gave them, not with words, but with loyalty. That winter, when she fell ill, the lamb lay beside her, night after night, warming her with its small, steady presence. She stitched a small silhouette of the lamb, hidden among the constellations. She named it the heart beside me. She felt it like a string tugged gently inside her chest. She took a blue thread, the exact color of her mother's shawl, and embroidered the name beneath the edge of a star. Small, almost hidden, but seen. She called that thread. The memory awakened. Because some things live only once you speak them. And before we sew a stitch in our own quilts, we gather around Isilda's quilt and see how her story continues. Clouds swallowed the sky. The moon hid. The stars blinked out. Isilda sat by the fire, quilt in lap, unsure of where to stitch. But the silence told her where. She reached for black wool, not for sorrow, but for stillness. She sewed a square entirely dark, with no light, no line, no shimmer. She named it The Night with No Stars. A place to rest when the sky forgets itself. Chapter 81. The name that woke the thread there was a name that Isilda had never spoken aloud. Chapter 82. The Night with No Stars. It was the darkest night the valley had ever known. Chapter 83. The Lamb Who Chose Her. There was a lamb born under the fox moon, wide-eyed and silent. Chapter 84. The sky beneath her feet. One rare summer dawn, as dew still clung to the heather Isilda. Chapter 85. The loops that laughed. The quilt wasn't all solemn skies and stilled breath. Sometimes it laughed. Chapter 86. The firefly line that midsummer. Fireflies returned to the hillside more than she had ever seen. Chapter 87. The quilt goes to market for the first time in many years. Isilda visited the village market not to buy or sell, but to share. Chapter 80. The stitch in someone else's hand one night. She left the quilt inside the weaving hall and forgot to lock the door. Chapter 89. The spiral of return. At the edge of the quilt, she began a spiral. Chapter 90. The last thread she saved, a final spool. It was tucked deep in the basket, wrapped in dried lavender and birch bark. We rest now, and may we wake when it is time to stitch. Tonight, we return to a tale, stitched by moonlight. Chapter 91. The first dream sown one twilight. As her hands moved without thought, Isilda dozed in her chair by the fire. In her dream, she walked along a ribbon of stars that floated above the pasture. Each step lit another square of the sky. Each footfall hummed. When she awoke, the needle was still and a line of stars now stretched across the corner of the quilt identical to those in her dream. She didn't remember sewing them. She named it The First Dream Sewn, because some stitches passed through sleep to reach the cloth. Chapter 92. The elder who remembered that winter. An elder shepherd visited her hill. His beard was snow white, his gait slow, but his eyes, oh, they sparkled. He ran his fingers across the quilt and paused at the thread that waited. This, he said, was told to me as a child. My grandmother knew of it, said stars must be earned. She offered him a needle. His fingers were unsteady, but he stitched a tiny golden knot beside hers. It looked like a sun. They named it together. The memories shared, because stories once heard can find their way home. Chapter 93. The rain that listened. It rained for 7 days. Not a storm, just a hush of mist and drizzle. Isilda brought the quilt inside but left the doors open so she could hear the rain. And it did seem to listen. It softened when she sang. It paused when she sighed. And one evening, she heard its answer in the hush between droplets. She stitched thin lines of rain threads, silvery, gray, and blue, slanting gently through the stars. She called this the rain that listened. For not all voices need to speak to be heard. Chapter 94. The invisible thread. There was a spool she had never dared use. It shimmered strangely in the firelight clear, yet not invisible in daylight, glowing at night. It had been gifted to her as a child by a weaver with no name. She finally held it one evening, her heart full of wonder and fear. And as she stitched, nothing showed. But at night, when she lay beside the quilt, a line glowed across the stars like moonlight on still water. She named it the invisible thread, because love, too, can be unseen and still bind us. Chapter 95. The shepherd's star in the high sky of late summer. One star always returned first, brightest, steadiest. When she was young, she thought it watched her flock. Now, she knew it watched her. She stitched it in the top right corner of the quilt, its threads thicker than the rest. Around it, she wove smaller sparks, those that followed its lead. She named this corner the Shepherd Star, a guide, a guardian, a star that keeps watch when we cannot. Chapter 96, the stitch that soothed. There were nights she could not sleep, nights when memories stirred too loudly. On those nights, she stitched in silence, not images, but patterns, repetitions, over and over, gentle arcs, slow spirals, soft zigzags. They calmed her breath. They tamed her thoughts. She didn't name those threads for years, until one child, years later, ran a finger over them and sighed. "This part makes me sleepy," she smiled and whispered its name. The stitch that's, because even in making, there is rest. Chapter 97. The comet's brush. One spring night, a comet streaked across the sky. It painted a curve of silver fire, long and slow and quiet. Every villager saw it, but Isilda was the only one who stitched it. She used a mix of thread silver, copper, pearland. Let them curve gracefully across 5 squares. It caught the light in odd ways, never quite the same. She named it the comet's brush, because sometimes wonder leaves a streak behind, just enough to remember. Chapter 98. The voice of the quilt. Years passed. The quilt had grown larger than the bed, wider than the loom, fuller than memory. One evening, she sat alone by the hearth, her hands idle, and she heard it, a hum, soft, low, like the sound of wind moving through long grass, or a lullaby hummed beneath breath. It was the quilt, not in words, but in warmth. She rested her head on its edge and closed her eyes, and in that stillness, she named it the voice of the quilt, because love speaks just, not always in words. Chapter 99. The passing of the spindle. One cold morning, a young girl appeared at her door, hair wild with wind, cheeks red from climbing, holding a lamb too small to walk. Isilda gave her Sue a blanket, a quiet place to sit. They talked little, but when the girl saw the quilt, her eyes filled. Isilda, without asking why, handed her the spindle. "Your turn," she said. The girl spun her first thread that evening, beside the fire, a green so soft it looked like moss kissed by dawn. Isilda called that moment the passing of the spindle, because all stories need new hands to carry them. Chapter 100. The quilt unfolds. Isilda was old when she finished the last square. It showed no stars, no sheep, no pattern, just a horizon, a line across sky and hill wide open. She stitched it with dawn colors, gentle pinks, soft lilacs, golden whispers. Not an ending, but a beginning. She laid the quilt over her lap, its weight like the sky itself, and whispered its name. The quilt unfolds. Then she closed her eyes and dreamed of starlight and stitches carried forward in hands yet to come. Let yourself drift. You are safe. You are warm. You are remembered. Welcome to this mini-series. Today's story is called The Shepherdess and the Sky Quilt. Come closer, little one. Rest your head against my shoulder. Listen to the hush of the wind wrapping around us. Chapter 101. The girl, her name was Ellen, stayed through the last winter. She learned slowly by watching, not just spinning and stitching, but listening to the sheep, to the wind's breath on the hills, to the hush before snowfall. When Isilda grew too tired to climb, Ellen took the flock herself. They stood around it silently, as though in a sacred grove. One child touched the square with the comet. Another old man knelt before the square, called the invisible thread. Ellen said little. She just welcomed them in, planted herbs around its walls. The flock still wandered nearby, descendants of those early sheep, and each year she laid the quilt across the soft grass, not to show it, but to let it feel the sun, to let the breeze turn its corners, to let the sky see itself. But in your hush, in your dreams, in that small, quiet space inside you that remembers starlight and wind and the warmth of wool upon your knees. Tonight, You are beneath the sky quilt. Every stitch, every sigh, every memory wraps around you. Let go now. The shepherdess watches still. The stars keep time, and the quilt sings softly, 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 until you sleep, until you dream, until we return again. A young boy asked, "What's it called?" And she paused, then spoke softly. "It's called the sky quilt, because that was what it had always been, a sky that remembered, a sky that healed, a sky that could be held." She walked with the rhythm of a quiet footstep and a curious heart. She brought it with her to schools, to quiet gatherings, to mountaintop vigils under stars. She taught others how to stitch, how to listen before threading. They added their own squares now, carefully sewn beside Isildus. A farmer wove in the moon cow. A midwife added the breath between cries. A wandering musician stitched the note that lingered, and so it grew again. But always with gentleness, always with breath. Each evening, she returned and placed a small stone by the hearth, a reminder of something she'd seen. One looked like a lamb. One glowed faintly under moonlight. Isolde named those stones the Watcher's gifts, because noticing is its own kind of weaving. Eyes wide, they whispered, "It's singing." Ellen sat quietly beside them and nodded. "Yes," she said, "it always does if you've listened long enough." And a child smiled, placed their hand upon the fabric, and fell back into dreams. They would one day stitch their own square. They would one day carry the quilt. Because all soft things, songs, stories, shepherds pass along, hand to hand, heart to heart. Let the sound of the spinner's wheel lull you like a cradle. For today, we spin a tale of sky and wool, of stars and a stitch in time. Close your eyes. Let the hush of the wind wrap around you. Our tale draws gently now to its final thread. Chapter 102. The Final Stitch. One night the fire was low, and the quilt was spread fully across the floor. It seemed to glow from within. Ellen sat beside Isilda, who now dozed more than she spoke. Just stillness. Ellen found her seated upright, the quilt across her knees, her hand resting gently on the very first square, a square that showed a sheep beneath a single star. Ellen covered her with another blanket, soft and clean. She let the quilt rest undisturbed for 7 nights. On the 8th morning, she carried it out and laid it beneath the dawn. The wind moved lightly over it, as though reading its threads, and Ellen whispered, "May you keep watching." The quilt beckoned. One corner and finished. Just one last place for thread. Ellen chose a soft lavender, the color of dusk meeting field. She stitched something simple. A sheep curled in sleep, its head on stars. When she finished, Isolde stirred and placed her hand over it. Then she smiled, once, deeply, and whispered, "Now it is whole." They called it the final stitch, and it was. Chapter 103. The quiet morning. Isilda passed, just before the snow molt. No storm, no sorrow. Chapter 104. The naming of the quilt. Villagers came from near and far, some to mourn, some to remember, but most came to see the quilt. Chapter 105. The quilt's journey. Ellen did not keep the quilt hidden. Chapter 106. The hill that waited. Though Ellen traveled, she always returned to the hill. She rebuilt the small stone hut. Chapter 107. The quilt that sings. One night, long years later, a child resting near the quilt stirred from sleep. Epilogue. You are in the quilt. And you, dear listener, yes, you now carry part of this quilt too. Not in your hands,